The war had ended. The treaties had been signed. The flags had been lowered and raised again. But when the noise of cannon fire faded, something unexpected followed. Silence. Not celebration, not immediate prosperity. Silence across fields that had been left untended. Silence in towns where storefronts stood half-stocked. Silence in government halls where leaders now faced a different kind of challenge. Independence had been declared, but independence was not the same as stability. In 1783, the United States existed more in idea than in structure. 13 former colonies had separated from British rule, but they had not yet fully learned how to function as one nation. There was no established capital city with permanent authority, no stable national currency trusted everywhere, no clear sense in daily life of what it meant to be American. People still identified first with their states: Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. The word nation felt large. The country was new. New in law. New in responsibility. New in uncertainty. The men who had led the revolution understood how to resist control. Now they faced a different task: how to govern without becoming what they had resisted. Farmers returned to fields that needed rebuilding. Merchants reopened trade routes that had been interrupted. Lawmakers gathered in modest rooms to debate systems that had never before existed. There were no guarantees, no historical model to copy exactly, no certainty that the experiment would succeed. And yet, across the Atlantic coast and into the interior, daily life resumed. Crops were planted. Goods were exchanged. Roads were traveled. The work of nation building did not begin with celebration. It began with repair. Over the next decades, the United States would construct institutions, expand territory, develop industry, absorb new populations, and gradually assume a larger role in global affairs. None of this happened all at once. There was no single moment when the country transformed from fragile republic to established power. Instead, it changed slowly, through paperwork and debate, through labor and endurance, through conflict and compromise. This is not a story of sudden triumph. It is a story of gradual formation of a country learning how to exist. From uncertain beginnings, under the Articles of Confederation, to the drafting of a constitution. From isolated states connected by rough roads to a network of railways, factories, and communication lines. From a modest presence in global trade to a nation whose decisions would affect much of the world. The United States did not begin as a finished idea. It began as a question. What would self-government look like? How would power be limited yet effective? How would growth be managed across vast distances? And could a nation formed through revolution sustain itself in peace? Over the next 2 hours, we will follow that development. Not through dramatic speeches or battlefield detail, but through the steady changes that shaped daily life, through infrastructure, through labor, through migration, through administration, through expansion, through responsibility. When America was new, its future was uncertain. Its institutions were fragile. Its identity was still forming. But from that uncertainty, structure emerged. And from that structure, influence. Let us begin where peace began, not with triumph, but with the quiet work that followed. The war had ended, but nothing felt finished. In the autumn of 1783, the air across the former colonies carried a strange stillness. There were no grand arches erected across dusty roads, no permanent monuments carved in stone, no parades stretching from harbor to hilltop. Victory existed mostly on paper, in ink signatures, in folded documents carried carefully between men who spoke in measured tones. Beyond that, life continued as it always had. The 13 states, no longer colonies. Not yet a unified country lay stretched along the Atlantic coast like scattered thoughts. Massachusetts in the north, Georgia in the south, each one accustomed to governing itself in its own fashion, each with its own currency, its own trade relationships, its own habits, its own suspicions. The word American was spoken occasionally, but it did not yet feel solid. In taverns, men still referred to themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers, or citizens of Pennsylvania. Their loyalties were local. Their concerns were immediate. The idea of belonging to something larger than their state felt abstract, almost theoretical. There was no strong central authority watching over them, no reliable national treasury, no consistent system of law that stretched from one end of the coastline to the other. Instead, there was space. Wide stretches of farmland, dirt roads softened by rain, ports that looked outward to Europe more often than toward neighboring states. The war had removed British rule. It had not yet replaced it with certainty. In small homes lit by candlelight, families spoke quietly about taxes, about debts, about crops that needed tending before winter set in. The revolution had been fought for independence, but independence did not automatically mean stability. Merchants worried about currency. Paper notes issued during the war had lost value. Some were nearly worthless. Trade felt uneven, unpredictable. Ships still crossed the Atlantic, but agreements were fragile. Farmers rose before dawn as they always had. They repaired fences. They checked livestock. They walked fields slowly, calculating yields in their minds. The soil did not care about declarations or treaties. It responded only to labor. In state assemblies, representatives argued about responsibility. Who would repay war debts? Who would maintain order? How strong should a national government be? There was fear beneath these discussions. Not fear of foreign invasion, that danger had lessened, but fear of recreating the very tyranny they had fought to escape. A strong central power felt dangerous. A weak one felt unstable. So the nation, if it could yet be called, that hovered in between. The Articles of Confederation provided a framework, but it was thin. Congress could request funds from the states, but it could not demand them. It could recommend policies, but enforcement depended on cooperation, and cooperation was not guaranteed. Travel between states remained slow. A journey that today might take hours required days or weeks. News moved at the pace of horses. Rumors moved slightly faster. Distance shaped everything. In rural communities, the larger political experiment unfolding along the eastern seaboard felt remote. What mattered more was the coming winter, the price of salt, the reliability of a neighbor. Independence did not arrive with a clear blueprint. It arrived with questions. What did it mean to be united? What did it mean to be governed by representatives rather than a king? What did it mean to trust fellow states that had once competed for trade and land? Even the capital itself was uncertain, shifting, temporary, debated. There was no grand city symbolizing permanence. Government officials met where arrangements could be made. The center of power felt movable, impermanent, like the country itself. And yet, beneath the uncertainty, something quieter was forming. A shared memory. Men from different colonies had fought alongside one another. They had endured cold winters, scarce supplies, exhaustion. They had written letters home describing not just battles, but companionship, shared hardship. That memory lingered. It did not yet bind the states tightly together. But it existed. Imports. Dockworkers unloaded goods stamped with foreign markings. Trade resumed cautiously. Ships carried tobacco, rice, fish, timber. The Atlantic remained vast and indifferent. But now, the goods leaving American shores were marked by a new reality. They came from a sovereign land, even if that sovereignty still felt fragile. At night, as candles burned low, maps lay unrolled across wooden tables, the boundaries of states drawn in ink, the western territories stretching outward into lands not fully mapped or understood. The shape of the country was there, in theory, but its identity was still soft around the edges. A country without a shape, not because it lacked borders, but because it lacked definition. It had survived war. Now it had to survive peace. And peace, in many ways, would prove more complicated. When the fighting stopped, the soldiers did not march into triumph. They walked home. Some traveled alone along narrow roads that cut through farmland and forest. Others moved in small groups, former regiments dissolving into scattered individuals as miles passed beneath worn boots. Uniforms were faded, many coats no longer matched. Weapons were carried not for ceremony, but because they were still useful tools. There were no organized welcomes waiting at most crossroads. The war had lasted years. Life had not paused in their absence. Farms had been managed by wives, brothers, aging fathers, and sometimes not managed at all. Tools had broken. Fences had collapsed. Livestock numbers had fallen. Fields that once produced steadily had grown uneven and wild. For many returning men, the first sight of home was not celebration, but work. Roofs needed patching, wells required clearing. Barn doors sagged on their hinges. Wood piles were low. Winter did not delay its arrival for veterans. Some soldiers returned with injuries that would not heal completely. Limping walks became permanent. Hands missing fingers struggled with familiar tasks. Chronic pain settled quietly into daily routines. Medical care had been limited during the war, and recovery often depended more on endurance than treatment. There was also the matter of payment. Many had fought under promises of wages or land grants, but the new government, still weak and financially strained, could not easily fulfill those promises. Paper currency issued during the conflict had lost value. Continental notes circulated, but merchants often refused them or accepted them only at steep discount. A veteran might carry folded payment in his pocket, only to discover it purchased little. Disappointment rarely erupted into public anger. It appeared instead in small adjustments, in tightened household budgets, in quiet discussions after dark about debts owed and debts unlikely to be repaid. Communities absorbed returning soldiers gradually. Church benches filled again. Local markets grew slightly busier, but the presence of former soldiers did not restore the economy immediately. Trade remained uneven. British goods, once boycotted, returned to markets in complicated ways. Some ports reopened cautiously, others struggled to regain pre-war stability. In rural regions, the absence of British authority had removed one structure, but nothing equally strong had replaced it. Local officials handled disputes as best they could. County courts operated with limited resources. Tax collection became more aggressive in some states, as governments sought revenue to pay accumulated war debts. For farmers already burdened, these taxes felt heavy. The war had been fought in part over taxation. Now taxation returned, imposed not by a distant king, but by state legislatures. The distinction mattered politically. It mattered less to families balancing accounts by candlelight. In certain regions, unrest simmered quietly. Farmers petitioned for relief. Some refused payment. A few organized protests. These tensions would later grow more visible, but in the immediate aftermath of the war, they appeared as scattered complaints and uneasy gatherings. Beyond economics, there was adjustment of another kind. Men who had lived 4 years in camps and on marshes found civilian life slower, yet more complicated. The rhythm of military command, clear orders, structured days, gave way to independent responsibility. Some adapted quickly. Others struggled with the transition from collective purpose to individual labor. For widows, the war had ended differently. Some husbands did not return. Graves were distant or unmarked. News of death had arrived months late, sometimes carried by letter, sometimes by rumor. Without pension systems fully in place, many widows relied on extended family or remarriage for stability. Children who had been small when fathers left were older now. Recognition could feel uncertain. Relationships resumed carefully. In towns that had seen direct fighting, physical damage lingered. Burned buildings were replaced slowly. Streets bore scars of troop movement. Certain houses stood empty, yet daily life pressed forward. Markets reopened on regular days. Blacksmiths resumed steady work, shaping tools instead of repairing weapons. Even celebrations of independence, when they occurred, were modest compared to later commemorations. Public readings of the Declaration had happened years earlier. The final peace treaty in 1783 formalized what many had already accepted. The war was over, but peace brought its own demands. The Continental Army disbanded gradually. Officers resigned commissions. Some attempted to enter politics. Others returned fully to private life. General George Washington himself resigned his command and went home to Mount Vernon. A gesture noted widely, signaling that military authority would not dominate the new republic. That act provided reassurance. It did not solve structural problems. Across the states, legislators debated how to handle unpaid soldiers, unsettled debts, and unstable currency. But the Bayes did not immediately produce relief. For many returning veterans, the immediate future was defined by planting seasons, harvest expectations, and local obligations. There were no federal relief programs, no centralized system to distribute aid efficiently. Assistance came from family networks, churches, and neighbors, or not at all. And so, in the years immediately following independence, the nation did not surge forward. It mended, slowly, sometimes unevenly, sometimes with frustration. Returning soldiers did not step into a country transformed. They stepped back into ordinary life, made more fragile by years of absence. The promise of independence remained real, but its benefits would take time to appear. And time, in the late 18th century, moved at the pace of weather, harvest cycles, and human endurance. The war had ended. The rebuilding had only begun. But rebuilding homes did not erase the financial burden left behind. Independence had been declared. Peace had been signed. But the bills remained. By 1783, the new United States carried enormous financial weight. The Continental Congress had borrowed heavily to fund the war. Individual states had done the same. Loans had been taken from foreign governments, particularly France and the Netherlands. Supplies had been purchased on credit. Soldiers had been promised wages the Treasury did not possess. Victory did not erase these obligations. It made them more urgent. The national government, operating under the Articles of Confederation, had limited authority. It could request funds from the states. It could recommend taxation, but it could not enforce collection. There was no stable national revenue stream, no consistent customs system, no reliable central bank. The states themselves faced similar difficulties. War had disrupted trade. Farms had been damaged. Ports had been blockaded for years. Right? Commerce is slowly bouncing back, but currency issues are still a real headache. During the war, Congress had issued paper money, continental currency, to pay expenses. At first, it circulated widely, but without sufficient backing, its value declined. Counterfeiting by the British worsened the problem. By war's end, many notes were nearly worthless. The phrase "not worth a continental" entered common speech. For ordinary people, this devaluation had real consequences. A farmer who had accepted paper money for crops in 1777 might find that by 1783, those same notes purchased only a fraction of their original value. Savings evaporated quietly. Barter returned in many areas. Corn, livestock, timber, and handmade goods were exchanged directly. Silver and gold coins remained scarce. Foreign coins circulated unevenly. Merchants struggled to price goods consistently. Trade between states required negotiation over acceptable forms of payment. Economic uncertainty lingered in everyday transactions. Meanwhile, creditors, both foreign and domestic, expected repayment. State governments began to increase taxes in order to meet debt obligations. These taxes often fell heavily on landowners and farmers. Payment was sometimes required in hard currency, not paper notes. For small farmers who possessed land but little coin, this demand created pressure. Harvests in the early post-war years were uneven in some regions. Weather did not always cooperate. Transport remained difficult. Markets were unstable. When crops failed or prices fell, tax payments became harder to meet. In Massachusetts and other states, debt collection intensified. Courts processed cases of unpaid loans. Property could be seized to satisfy obligations. For families already living close to subsistence, the loss of land represented more than financial hardship. It threatened survival. Hunger did not become widespread famine, but scarcity was familiar in many households. Meat was rationed carefully. Bread was stretched with alternative grains when wheat ran low. Families relied heavily on preserved foods through winter months. Independence had not created abundance. It had created responsibility. The new nation had to prove it could honor its debts. International credibility depended on it. If foreign governments lost confidence, future trade and loans would be restricted. Diplomatic standing required financial reliability. Yet raising revenue without centralized authority proved difficult. Some states complied more willingly with congressional requests than others. Political disagreements slowed cooperation. Regional priorities differed. Coastal commercial states sometimes viewed financial obligations differently from interior farming communities. At the same time, westward lands offered a possible solution. The vast territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains represented potential revenue through land sales. If organized and sold properly, western lands could help pay national debt. But these territories were not empty. Indigenous nations lived there, traded there, governed there. Expansion required negotiation, treaties, and often conflict. Even as Congress debated land ordinances, realities on the frontier remained complex and unstable. Within towns and villages, economic strain shaped daily conversation. Artisans adjusted prices cautiously. Shopkeepers extended credit selectively. Families postponed purchases of non-essential goods. Weddings were modest. Construction projects delayed. The promise of a prosperous republic seemed distant to many. In 1786 and 1787, financial distress contributed to open unrest in western Macedonia. Farmers burdened by debt and high taxes organized protests against court proceedings that threatened foreclosure. Led in part by Daniel Shays, groups attempted to prevent courts from operating. The rebellion did not spread widely across the nation, but it alarmed political leaders. It revealed how fragile internal stability remained. If economic grievances could escalate into armed resistance so soon after independence, the structure of government required strengthening. The events were contained. Order was restored. But the lesson lingered. Economic survival and political stability were closely connected. For ordinary citizens, however, the focus remained practical. Planting had to occur on schedule. Livestock required tending regardless of congressional debates. Children needed clothing. Wood needed cutting before winter. Independence did not guarantee prosperity. It demanded adaptation. Over time, proposals emerged to address financial weakness. Stronger federal powers to tax and regulate commerce were discussed. The idea of assuming state debts at the national level gained supporters. Plans for a national bank would later take shape. But in the early years after the war, these solutions had not yet been implemented. The nation lived in a condition of financial experiment. Debt weighed on ledgers. Hunger hovered at the margins. Freedom existed alongside hardship. And slowly, through debate, conflict, and adjustment, the young republic began to understand that winning independence had been only the first step. Sustaining it required discipline. It required structure. And it required a willingness to confront the cost of freedom long after the cannons had fallen silent. Economic strain revealed something deeper, the limits of the government itself. Winning independence had removed British authority. It did not automatically create effective American authority. Under the Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war, the United States functioned as a loose alliance of sovereign states. Each state retained significant power. Congress served as a coordinating body rather than a commanding one. There was no executive branch to enforce laws. There was no national court system to interpret them. There was no power to levy taxes directly on citizens. Congress could declare war, negotiate treaties, and request funds from the states, but it depended on voluntary compliance. In theory, this structure protected liberty. The memory of British overreach remained vivid. Many Americans feared concentrated power more than inefficiency. A weak central government appeared safer than a strong one. In practice, however, weaknesses became increasingly visible. When Congress requested financial contributions from the states, payments were inconsistent. Some states paid partially, others delayed. A few ignored requests entirely. Without reliable revenue, the national government struggled to pay debts or maintain basic administrative functions. Diplomatic negotiations were also complicated. Foreign governments preferred dealing with stable central authorities. Yet American representatives abroad could not guarantee that states would uphold agreements consistently. Trade policy presented another challenge. Individual states imposed their own tariffs and regulations. Goods crossing state lines could face varying fees. Rather than functioning as a single economic unit, the country operated as 30 distinct markets. Commercial rivalries emerged. Instead of strengthening collective prosperity, states sometimes competed with one another for advantage. Meanwhile, disputes between states required resolution. Boundary disagreements, navigation rights along shared rivers, and conflicting land claims created tension. Without a strong national judiciary, these disputes depended on negotiation and compromise. In many cases, compromise succeeded, but the absence of enforcement mechanisms meant solutions rested heavily on goodwill. Political leaders recognized these difficulties gradually. Meetings between state delegates increased. Discussions about reform grew more frequent. The idea that the Articles might require revision gained attention, yet there was caution. Any movement toward stronger, central authority risked criticism. Some feared that reform would recreate the very centralized power they had resisted during colonial rule. Public opinion varied widely. In rural areas, many citizens focused on local governance and immediate concerns. State legislatures felt closer and more accountable than distant Congress. Skepticism toward national expansion of power remained common. At the same time, economic instability and episodes like Shays' Rebellion underscored the need for coordinated response. If the national government could not maintain order or manage financial obligations, independence itself could be jeopardized. Gradually, conversations shifted from minor adjustments to more substantial reform. In 1786, representatives from several states met in Annapolis to discuss trade issues. Attendance was limited, but the meeting concluded with a recommendation. A broader convention should be held to consider changes to the Articles of Confederation. That recommendation led to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Before that convention assembled, however, daily governance continued under existing constraints. Congress met intermittently, often struggling to secure enough delegates for quorum. Legislation passed slowly. Proposals for revenue measures stalled. State governments experimented with their own policies. Some issued paper money to stimulate local economies. Others adopted stricter fiscal approaches. These differing strategies sometimes caused friction across state lines. Law enforcement remained primarily local. Sheriffs, constables, and county courts handled most disputes. National identity, in legal terms, remained secondary to state affiliation. The absence of a permanent national capital symbolized this transitional period. Congress met in various cities: New York, Philadelphia, Princeton, Annapolis, depending on circumstances and political considerations. The government did not yet possess a fixed geographic center. For ordinary citizens, governance appeared distant and sometimes abstract. Taxes were collected locally. Laws were debated in state assemblies. National debates were reported in newspapers, but implementation felt remote. And yet, beneath this decentralized system, a shift was occurring. The generation that had fought the war had developed experience in cooperation. Military coordination across colonies had required compromise and shared planning. That experience shaped political thinking. Leaders such as James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others began advocating for stronger federal structure. They argued that liberty required stability, and stability required authority capable of acting decisively when necessary. Opponents cautioned that concentration of power could erode freedoms hard-won in revolution. The debate was not about independence from Britain anymore. It was about how Americans would govern themselves. Would sovereignty reside primarily in the states, or would it be shared more fully with the national government? The question did not resolve quickly. It moved through pamphlets, private letters, legislative sessions, and public meetings. Newspapers carried essays, arguing both positions. Political language evolved as citizens grappled with abstract concepts: representation, federalism, checks and balances. These ideas did not emerge fully formed. They developed through disagreement. By the mid-1780s, many recognized that the existing framework was insufficient. But few agreed on the precise solution. The nation remained experimental. Independence had granted opportunity. Now Americans faced the task of designing governance that balanced strength and restraint. Learning to govern themselves would require patience. It would require negotiation. And it would require accepting that liberty without structure could drift toward instability. The Articles of Confederation had served their purpose during war. In peace, their limitations became clearer, and the young republic stood on the edge of significant change. Reform required gathering once more. Not for war, but for design. In the spring of 1787, delegates began arriving in Philadelphia. They did not gather to celebrate victory. They gathered because something was not working. The official purpose of the convention was modest: to revise the Articles of Confederation. The expectation, at least publicly, was improvement, not replacement. But many who traveled to Pennsylvania suspected that deeper change would be necessary. The journey itself reflected the condition of the country. Roads were uneven. Travel required days or weeks. Delegates arrived at different times, lodging in boarding houses and private homes, carrying letters of instruction from their states. 55 men would eventually participate. They varied in age, profession, and political philosophy. Some were veterans of the Revolution, some were experienced legislators. A few were younger, eager to shape a new system. Not all states were equally enthusiastic. Rhode Island refused to send delegates at all, wary of expanding federal power. Meetings took place inside the Pennsylvania State House, in a room that would later be known as Independence Hall. Windows were closed for privacy despite the summer heat. Guards were posted outside. Deliberations were to remain confidential. Secrecy was considered necessary. If proposals failed, public confidence in the fragile Union could weaken further. Early discussions moved quickly beyond simple revision. The articles, many concluded, could not merely be adjusted. They required replacement. The Virginia Plan, introduced by Edmund Randolph and largely drafted by James Madison, proposed a new framework. It called for a stronger national government with separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Representation in the legislature would be based on a population. Large states tended to favor this approach. Smaller states expressed concern. Equal representation under the Articles had protected their influence. A population-based system could reduce their power significantly. The debate was careful, but firm. The New Jersey Plan emerged as an alternative. It proposed maintaining equal representation for each state while granting limited additional powers to the national government. Neither side dismissed the other entirely. But agreement was not immediate. Compromise developed slowly. The Connecticut Compromise, sometimes called the Great Compromise, proposed a bicameral legislature. One chamber, the House of Representatives, would reflect population. The other, the Senate, would grant equal representation to each state. This structure balanced competing interests. The decision did not satisfy all concerns, but it allowed progress. Other questions required equally delicate handling. How would the executive be chosen? How long would terms last? What powers would the president hold? The convention rejected both a single lifetime executive and a weak committee. Instead, delegates settled on a single president elected for a limited term, with powers defined and constrained. The method of election, the Electoral College, reflected further compromise, blending state influence with popular input. Slavery presented one of the most difficult issues. Southern states depended heavily on enslaved labor for economic stability. Northern states were moving gradually toward abolition or reduced reliance. Representation and taxation required counting population. But how would enslaved individuals be considered? The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved persons as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. It did not resolve moral conflict. It postponed it. Delegates understood that certain issues were being deferred. The immediate goal was union. Without union, independence itself remained vulnerable. Discussions extended through the summer. Heat accumulated inside the closed chamber. Arguments resurfaced in different forms. Drafts were revised repeatedly. Language was scrutinized carefully. The Constitution did not emerge fully formed. It was constructed through negotiation. Some delegates left dissatisfied. A few refused to sign the final document, but on September 17, 1787, 39 delegates affixed their names. The Constitution was not yet law. It required ratification by the states. The document proposed significant changes. It granted Congress power to levy taxes, regulate commerce, raise armies, and enforce laws directly. It created a federal judiciary and established an executive branch. For some, these powers appeared necessary for stability. For others, they appeared dangerous. Public debate began immediately. Pamphlets circulated widely. Supporters, writing under pseudonyms such as Publius, defended the Constitution in essays, later known as the Federalist Papers. Opponents warned of centralized authority undermining local control. State conventions convened to consider ratification. Speeches were delivered. Amendments were proposed. The promise of a Bill of Rights' explicit protections for individual liberties helped secure support in several states. Ratification did not proceed uniformly. Some states approved quickly. Others hesitated. North Carolina and Rhode Island ratified only after the new government had already begun operating. But by 1788, the required 9 states had ratified. The Constitution would take effect. The transition required planning. Elections were organized. George Washington was chosen unanimously as the first president. The new Congress prepared to assemble. The Articles of Confederation had governed a nation in war. The Constitution would attempt to govern it in peace. It did not eliminate disagreement. It did not remove tension between state and federal authority, but it created structure where previously there had been uncertainty. It provided mechanisms for taxation, law enforcement, and dispute resolution. It established a process for amendment, acknowledging that future change would be necessary. The convention in Philadelphia did not declare final answers to every question. Instead, it created a framework flexible enough to endure disagreement. The men who left Philadelphia that autumn understood that their work was incomplete. Ratification battles lay ahead. Implementation would reveal weaknesses and require adjustment, but the nation now possessed a defined system of governance. The country, once without a clear shape, had drawn sharper lines. Those lines would be tested. They would be debated, but they would hold. And the long experiment of self-government entered a new phase. On the right hand, the Constitution had to function in daily practice. The Constitution had been ratified. Now it had to function. In 1789, the new federal government began operating under its revised structure. There were no grand marble buildings waiting, no established departments fully staffed and organized. Government, like the nation itself, had to assemble piece by piece. New York City served as the first capital under the Constitution. Federal Hall became the meeting place for Congress. Offices were modest. Furniture was practical rather than ceremonial. Paperwork accumulated quickly. George Washington took the oath of office in April 1789. The event was observed respectfully, but without excessive display. Authority in the new republic was intended to appear measured, not monarchical. The executive branch required definition. Departments were created gradually. The Department of State handled foreign affairs. The Department of the Treasury managed finances. The Department of War oversaw military matters. Each required clerks, correspondence systems, storage for documents, and consistent procedures. Daily work began early. Clerks arrived carrying bundles of letters. Quills were sharpened. Ink was prepared. Papers were copied by hand. Ledgers recorded expenses carefully. Communication depended on physical movement, sealed envelopes delivered by horse or ship. Routine formed slowly. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton developed plans to stabilize national finances. He proposed federal assumption of state debts, the establishment of a national bank, and structured taxation. These proposals required legislative debate and public explanation. Meetings in Congress extended long into the day. Representatives reviewed reports, drafted bills, negotiated amendments. The work was deliberate. Outside the Capitol, citizens followed developments through newspapers. Reports from Congress traveled slowly but steadily. Political parties had not yet fully formed, but differences of opinion were becoming more visible. In 1790, Congress approved a permanent capital along the Potomac River. Until it was constructed, the government would relocate to Philadelphia. The move required planning. Documents were packed into crates. Office furniture transported. Clerks and officials relocated with families and possessions. Government, still portable, adjusted to new. Philadelphia, already an established city, offered improved facilities. Yet even there, federal offices remained modest compared to European governments. The new administration worked to establish credibility. Customs duties were organized at ports to generate revenue. Tax collection systems were formalized. Federal courts began hearing cases under the new judiciary. Law, once primarily local, now had national dimension. The Bill of Rights, proposed during ratification debates, was adopted in 1791. These first 10 amendments clarified protections for speech, religion, press, assembly, and due process. Their inclusion reassured skeptics concerned about centralized authority. Government was no longer theoretical. It had daily tasks. It collected revenue. It processed applications. It issued instructions. And with each passing month, procedures became more predictable. Postal routes expanded. Official correspondence traveled along established networks. The post office became one of the most visible arms of federal presence, connecting distant towns through regular communication. Departments developed filing systems. Records were preserved systematically. Archives grew. Government became less fragile. It acquired habit. Washington's presidency set important precedents. He served 2 terms, then stepped down voluntarily, reinforcing the principle of limited executive tenure. His farewell address cautioned against sectional division and excessive partisanship. By the late 1790s, political differences had organized into more recognizable factions. Federalists and Democratic Republicans debated the scope of federal power, relations with foreign nations, and economic policy. Elections transferred authority peacefully in 1800, when Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency. This transition, though tense, demonstrated the stability of constitutional processes. While leaders debated policy, clerks continued copying documents. Courts continued hearing cases. Revenue offices continued inspecting cargo at docks. The capital itself moved again in 1800 to the newly constructed city of Washington. At that time, it remained small and partially unfinished. The Capitol building stood incomplete. Streets were muddy. Surrounding land remained rural. Yet, permanence had been chosen. The federal government now possessed a fixed location. Daily routine persisted regardless of surroundings. The Treasury calculated tariffs. The War Department tracked troop assignments. The State Department corresponded with foreign and gradually, citizens became accustomed to national institutions. The existence of federal courts, national taxes, and executive authority ceased to feel experimental. They became part of the landscape. This normalization did not eliminate disagreement. Political debate remained active and often sharp, but disagreement occurred within established boundaries. The government functioned. It collected revenue reliably. It repaid portions of national debt. It negotiated treaties. It enforced federal law when necessary. The early republic had shifted from survival to administration. Routine replaced uncertainty. In offices lined with wooden desks and shelves of ledgers, the abstract ideas debated in Philadelphia translated into daily practice. Nation building was not dramatic. It was procedural. Authorities strengthened not through spectacle, but through repetition. Each day that government functioned without collapse reinforced legitimacy. Each peaceful election deepened stability. The new capital did not shine with grandeur. It operated with discipline. And through that discipline, the country gained structure. The United States was no longer a nation without shape. It had offices. It had departments. It had routine. And routine, more than rhetoric, secured its foundation. Administration required connection, and connection required in the early years of the Republic. Distance remained one of the country's greatest challenges. The United States stretched along the Atlantic coast and extended inland toward territories that were still being mapped, but physical connection between regions was limited. Travel was slow. Communication required patience. Movement of goods depended on geography and weather. Roads were often little more than widened paths. In dry conditions, they were dusty and uneven. After rain, they became heavy with mud. Wagons broke axles. Horses tired quickly. Journeys that appear short on a map could take days. For farmers bringing crops to market, transportation was a serious concern. Grain and produce had to reach towns before spoiling. Livestock had to survive the journey. The condition of a road could determine profit or loss. Rivers offered more reliable routes. Flatboats and barges carried goods downstream more efficiently than wagons could carry them overland. The Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and other waterways served as commercial arteries, linking inland settlements to larger trade networks. However, river travel had limitations. Moving downstream was easier than returning upstream. Goods often floated one way and required alternative arrangements for the return journey. Recognizing these challenges, leaders began discussing improvements to infrastructure. The Constitution granted Congress authority to regulate interstate commerce. That authority implied the need for better connections between states. One of the earliest federal infrastructure efforts was the development of postal roads. The Post Office Act of 1792 formalized mail routes, allowing information to travel more consistently. Post riders became familiar figures along established paths. Reliable communication strengthened economic and political coordination. States also undertook road-building projects. Turnpike companies were chartered to construct and maintain improved roads funded by tolls. These private-public partnerships aimed to reduce travel time and encourage trade. Yet progress was gradual. Constructing durable roads required labor, materials, and funding. Many regions lacked sufficient capital. Improvements concentrated first in more populated areas, leaving frontier settlements dependent on rough paths. Waterways continued to dominate commerce. The success of early canal projects demonstrated what controlled navigation could achieve. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, would later connect the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, transforming trade patterns. But even before large canals, smaller projects illustrated the potential of engineered routes. Infrastructure development carried political debate. Some argued that federal involvement in internal improvements exceeded constitutional authority. Others believed national investment was necessary for unity and prosperity. Presidents and legislators weighed these arguments carefully. Despite disagreement, incremental progress continued. Bridges replaced ferries in certain regions. Roads were graded and drained more effectively. River navigation improved with better boat design. Transportation improvements influenced settlement patterns. Farmers preferred land with access to markets. Towns located along rivers or major roads grew more quickly than isolated communities. Infrastructure also supported national defense. Efficient movement of troops and supplies depended on passable routes. Leaders recognized that weak transportation networks limited military readiness. As the country expanded westward, the need for connection intensified. Settlers moving into the Northwest Territory required supply lines. Land sales depended on accessible routes. The federal government authorized surveys and mapping projects to organize territory systematically. The National Road, begun in 1811, represented one of the first major federally funded highways. It connected the Potomac River to the Ohio River, facilitating westward movement. Though completed in stages, it symbolized a growing acceptance that national development required physical links. Still, travel remained demanding. A journey from Boston to Philadelphia could require several days under favorable conditions. Winter weather could halt movement entirely. Flooded rivers delayed shipments. Merchants factored transportation time into pricing. Delays increased costs. Unpredictable routes discouraged certain forms of trade. Improved connection gradually changed this pattern. As roads and canals expanded, markets widened. Farmers gained access to distant buyers. Manufacturers could ship goods beyond local communities. Regional specialization increased, with certain areas focusing on specific crops or products. Communication improved alongside transportation. Newspapers circulated more widely. Political information reached remote areas more quickly. Shared news contributed to shared identity. Distance had once isolated states from one another. Connection began to reduce that isolation. The effort required coordination between local governments, state legislatures, and federal authorities. It required investment and maintenance. It required acceptance that national unity depended not only on shared principles, but on practical accessibility. Infrastructure rarely attracted the same attention as political debates. It did not generate dramatic speeches or immediate transformation. Instead, it operated quietly. A road graded properly allowed wagons to travel more consistently. A canal shortened transport time. A postal route ensured regular communication. Each improvement strengthened economic stability and administrative cohesion. The early republic learned that governing a nation required more than drafting laws. It required building pathways for goods, for information, for people. Over time, these routes bound regions more closely together. The United States remained geographically vast and diverse. But with each mile of road and each navigable river, the distance between states became less isolating. Connection, once limited and uncertain, grew steadily more reliable. And through that reliability, the nation became more integrated. After the Revolution, America was a nation of farms. The landscape was rural, dominated by small villages and the quiet rhythm of agricultural life. But change was stirring, not in a sudden explosion, but in a slow, steady creep. Towns began to expand, almost imperceptibly at first. A new shop here, a blacksmith's yard there. A second church to hold a growing congregation. The empty spaces between houses slowly filled in. The first real pulse of urban life came from the coast. Ports like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, already established, became vital hubs. With independence secured, American ships sailed freely. They arrived packed with goods and news from Europe and left laden with tobacco, timber, and grain. From sunrise to sunset, docks were a flurry of activity, and warehouses swelled to hold the increasing flow of trade. This new stability in national finance gave merchants confidence, and where confidence goes, investment follows. But it wasn't just the coast. Inland, new arteries of commerce were forming. Towns sprang up along rivers, newly dug canals, and major roads. These weren't just dots on a map. They were magnets for settlers. Taverns and inns offered rest for weary travelers, and small banks opened their doors, fueling local dreams and enterprises. This urban growth wasn't just about buildings and trade routes. It was reshaping the very fabric of daily life. Town markets became vibrant centers of exchange. Farmers would bring their produce in, haggling face-to-face with buyers. For the first time, national currency circulated with real confidence. Skilled artisans, tailors, cobblers, carpenters no longer had to wander the countryside for work. They set up permanent shops in town, finding a concentrated base of customers. The town itself began to look different, with more permanent courthouses and town halls rising as symbols of civic pride and development. Of course, growth brought density. Houses were built shoulder to shoulder. The quiet of the countryside was replaced by the clatter of horse-drawn carts and the constant ringing of church bells marking the hours. This new proximity required organization. Volunteer fire brigades formed a crucial defense against the ever-present threat of fire in cities built of wood. Basic water systems were improved, and though sanitation was a major challenge, people were slowly becoming aware of public health. A major engine of this expansion was immigration. Throughout the early 19th century, families arrived from Europe, drawn by the promise of opportunity. Many landed in port cities and stayed, adding their labor, languages, and customs to the urban mix. You'd see Catholic churches rising near Protestant ones, and distinct ethnic neighborhoods forming street by street. It was a gradual, sometimes messy, process of integration. The biggest draw for immigrants and native-born Americans alike was economic opportunity. Young men and women left the predictable life of the farm for the uncertain promise of the city. They found work in workshops, small factories, or as domestic servants. An apprenticeship in a skilled trade could be a young person's ticket to a better life. This isn't to say cities were a paradise. Urban growth didn't erase poverty. In some districts, housing was crowded and grim. Work could be unstable, with wages rising and falling with demand. But the mere possibility of upward mobility, the chance to make something of yourself, was a powerful lure that kept people coming. City governments struggled to keep up. They passed local laws to regulate markets and construction, and law enforcement was often a patchwork of constables and volunteer watch groups. Yet, for all their challenges, cities offered clear advantages. You could get goods more reliably. News and information traveled much faster. Political debate thrived in taverns and public squares, and in the larger cities, newspapers were printed and read daily. The presence of government itself, from Washington, D.C. to the various state capitals, anchored the importance of these urban centers. As the century wore on, some towns exploded into major commercial hubs. New York City, with its magnificent harbor and the game-changing Erie Canal, became a titan of trade. For the first time, people started thinking about urban planning. Cities began laying out streets in grids, and even proposed public parks to offer a bit of green amidst the density. Small improvements, like paved roads and gas lighting, started to appear. Still, it's important to keep perspective. By our standards, these cities were tiny. Buildings were rarely more than a few stories high, and getting around meant walking or taking a horse-drawn carriage. The transformation wasn't a revolution, it was an evolution. But America was changing. The population was getting denser. Work was becoming more specialized. The economy was becoming more interconnected. Towns that were once just administrative outposts were now economic engines, beginning to shape national finance, politics, and culture. Numerically, America was still a rural nation, but the tide was turning. The nation wasn't just spreading outward across the vast frontier. It was also concentrating inward. The markets grew louder, the workshops multiplied, and the streets filled with movement. Cities did not yet define the country, but they were beginning to shape it. The steady rhythm of the farm was slowly being joined by the energetic pulse of the city, a pulse that would only grow stronger. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to live during the time of Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton? Beyond the famous battles and political debates, what was daily life like for ordinary people in the new American Republic? Let's travel back in time, to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and explore the sights, sounds, and struggles of everyday existence. Picture this. You wake up, not to an alarm clock, but to the rooster crowing or the first light of dawn. For over 90% of Americans, life was rural. Your home is likely a simple, one- or two-room wooden house. If you're lucky, you have glass-pane windows, but many families still made do with oiled paper or wooden shutters. The centerpiece of the home is the hearth, the fireplace. It's your only source of heat and your only stove. Every meal is cooked over an open flame, a process that takes hours of careful work. So what's for breakfast? Forget your avocado toast or cereal. You're likely eating some form of cornmeal, mush, or porridge, maybe with a bit of molasses if you can afford it. Meat was a luxury for many. You might have some salted pork or fish that was preserved to last through the seasons. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available when they were in season, and you grew them yourself in your family garden. Water had to be hauled by hand from a well or a nearby stream, a daily chore that fell to women and children. Life revolved around the seasons and the sun. The workday started at sunrise and ended at sunset. For farmers, this meant grueling physical labor, plowing fields with oxen, sowing seeds by hand, and harvesting crops with a scythe. There were no tractors or combines. Everything depended on muscle power, animal power, and a bit of luck with the weather. A bad harvest could mean a winter of hunger. Women's work was just as demanding, though often less visible. Their domain was the home and the farmyard. They were responsible for cooking all the meals from scratch, baking bread, churning butter, and preserving food for the winter. They spun wool and flax into thread, wove that thread into cloth, and then sewed all the family's clothing by hand. They tended the vegetable garden, cared for the chickens, milked the cows, and of course raised the children, of which there were often many. It was a world of constant, never-ending tasks. And what about the children? Their childhood was short. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to the family's survival. Young boys would help their fathers in the fields, learning to farm and hunt. Girls would learn domestic skills from their mothers, preparing for their future roles as wives and homemakers. Formal schooling was a rarity, especially in rural areas. Only about half of the population could read or write. For most, education came from the Bible, an almanac, and the practical lessons of farm life. Now, let's step away from the farm and into the bustling, growing cities like Philadelphia, New York, or Boston. Life here was different, but not necessarily easier. The streets were unpaved, often muddy and filled with horse-drawn carriages, carts, and livestock. There were no sanitation systems. Garbage and waste were simply thrown into the streets, creating an unimaginable stench and a breeding ground for disease. In the city, you might be an artisana, blacksmith, a silversmith, a shoemaker, or a printer. You'd likely live in a small apartment or a room above your workshop. Your day was still ruled by sunlight, but instead of a field, your world was the clatter and noise of your craft. You worked long hours, honing your skills to produce goods for the community. Journeymen and apprentices would work alongside a master craftsman, hoping to one day have their own shop. The city was also a center of commerce and information. Taverns were more than just places to drink. They were social hubs, where people gathered to discuss politics, read the latest newspapers often aloud to those who couldn't read and exchange news from distant towns. The port was the city's lifeline, with ships arriving from Europe and the Caribbean, bringing imported goods, new immigrants, and news from across the ocean. This constant flow of people and ideas made city life dynamic and exciting, but also crowded and unpredictable. Social life, whether in the country or the city, was centered on the community. Neighbors relied on each other for everything. House raisings, husking bees, and quilting parties were common events where people would come together to help with a large task and enjoy each other's company. The church was another cornerstone of community life, serving not only as a place of worship but also as a social and civic center. But let's not romanticize the past. Life was hard and it was fragile. Disease was a constant threat. Epidemics of yellow fever, smallpox, and influenza could sweep through a community, killing thousands. With limited medical knowledge, a simple infection or a broken bone could be a death sentence. The average life expectancy was under 40 years old. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and infant. Nearly every family experienced the tragedy of losing a child. It's also crucial to remember that this American life was not the same for everyone. For the hundreds of thousands of enslaved African Americans, life was a brutal reality of forced labor, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of violence and family separation. Their daily existence was defined by the complete denial of freedom and the struggle to maintain their humanity and culture in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Their contributions, their labor, and their suffering are fundamental, though often silenced. Part of this story, similarly, Native American communities were facing immense pressure and violence as the new nation expanded westward. Their way of life, which had existed for centuries, was being systematically dismantled through treaties, forced removals, and conflict. Their daily life was one of resistance, adaptation, and a desperate fight to preserve their lands and traditions. So, when we look back at the early American Republic, we see a world of stark contrasts. It was a time of incredible optimism and nation-building, but also one of immense hardship and deep injustice. It was a life of simple, rural rhythms, punctuated by the rapid, chaotic growth of cities. People were self-reliant and deeply connected to their communities, but also vulnerable to the whims of nature and disease. The world they inhabited is almost unrecognizable from our own. No electricity, no running water, no instant communication. Every aspect of life required a level of physical effort and patience that is hard for us to imagine today. But it was in this challenging world that the foundations of modern America were laid, not just by famous founders in government halls, but by millions of ordinary people, farmers, artisans, women, immigrants, and the enslaved whose daily struggles and quiet resilience shaped the nation. Thinking about their lives gives us a powerful perspective on our own. The conveniences we take for granted were the luxuries they could only dream of. Their story is a reminder of how far we've come, and the enduring human spirit that pushes us forward. In the early decades of the 19th century, change did not announce itself loudly. It began along rivers. Water had always powered mills for grinding grain. Now, it powered machinery for manufacturing. Wooden water wheels turned steadily, transferring motion through gears and belts to machines inside nearby buildings. The shift from hand production to mechanical production was gradual, but its effects were lasting. Textile manufacturing led much of this transformation. In New England, entrepreneurs established mills that spun thread and wove cloth at scales previously impossible in small workshops. Water from rivers such as the Merrimack provided consistent energy. The Lowell mills in Massachusetts became one of the most visible examples. Young women, often from farming families, were recruited to work in these factories. They lived in boarding houses supervised by matrons, followed strict schedules, and worked long hours at looms and spinning frames. The system combined industrial labor with structured housing and moral oversight. It was presented as respectable employment for unmarried women. Factory bells regulated time. Workers began early in the morning. Machinery ran throughout the day. Noise inside mills was constant, the rhythm of gears and belts replacing the quiet of domestic spinning wheels. Industrialization did not eliminate rural labor. Agriculture remained dominant in most regions. But the presence of factories introduced a new economic pattern. Production became centralized. Output increased. Costs per unit declined. In addition to textiles, iron production expanded. Foundries operated near sources of ore and fuel. Improved blast furnaces increased capacity. Iron tools, rails, and machinery components became more widely available. Steam power gradually supplemented water power. Though early steam engines were less efficient, they allowed factories to operate in locations not dependent on river flow. This flexibility would become more important as industrialization progressed. Transportation development supported industrial growth. Canals reduced shipping costs for heavy materials. Later, railroads accelerated movement of goods and raw materials. The relationship between industry and infrastructure was reciprocal. Factories required transport networks. Transport networks relied on manufactured materials. Labor organization began to shift. Unlike farm work, factory labor separated workers from control over production. Owners and managers directed operations. Employees performed specialized tasks within larger systems. Wages replaced subsistence farming as primary income for growing numbers of workers. Urban centers expanded in response. Towns located near factories grew quickly. Housing demands increased. Commercial districts developed to serve industrial populations. Working conditions were demanding. Safety standards were minimal. Machinery could cause injury. Ventilation was limited. Hours remained long. Yet industrial employment offered regular wages, in contrast to uncertain farm yields. Immigrants increasingly filled factory positions, particularly in northern cities. Irish, German, and later other European groups supplied labor for mills, construction, and transportation projects. Industrial growth also widened regional differences. Northern states developed manufacturing capacity. Southern states remained largely agricultural, with plantation economies centered on cotton production. Cotton itself connected these regions. Southern plantations supplied raw cotton to northern mills. Northern merchants financed and shipped goods. The economic system linked different labor structures across regions. Financial institutions adapted to support industrial expansion. Banks provided loans for factory construction and equipment purchase. Investment networks formed. Capital accumulation accelerated. Industrialization influenced daily life beyond the workplace. Mass-produced goods became more available. Ready-made clothing appeared gradually. Household items were produced in greater quantities. Consumers gained access to products that had previously required custom craftsmanship. Time discipline became more structured. Factory schedules encouraged punctuality. Urban life increasingly followed clock-based organization rather than natural daylight alone. At the same time, industrial growth prompted questions about labor rights and social conditions. Early worker associations formed to address wages and hours. Public debate about factory regulation began modestly. However, in its early stages, industrialization was not universally visible. Large portions of the country remained agricultural. Many Americans continued to live in small communities with limited exposure to factory life. The rise of industry was uneven. It concentrated in certain regions. It advanced in phases, but its direction was clear. Productivity increased steadily. Output of textiles, iron, and manufactured goods expanded. Transportation improvements reduced costs and time of distribution. The economy diversified. The United States was no longer solely a collection of farms and small workshops. It was beginning to produce at scale. This transformation did not eliminate hardship. Factory labor required endurance similar to agricultural work, though of a different kind. Long hours, repetitive motion, and confined spaces replaced open fields. Yet the capacity of the nation increased. Industrial output strengthened economic independence. Dependence on imported manufactured goods declined. Domestic markets expanded. The quiet rise of industry reshaped the country without dramatic declaration. It altered how people worked. It altered where they lived. It altered how goods were made and moved. The change was steady, mechanical, and persistent, and it would continue to expand, carrying the young nation further from its rural beginnings and toward a more complex economic future. As the United States expanded economically, it also changed demographically. New people arrived. Some crossed state borders from rural areas into growing towns. Others crossed oceans. Together, they reshaped the population in ways that were gradual but significant. Immigration was not new. People from Europe had been arriving for generations. What's changed after independence was scale and permanence. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, increasing numbers of immigrants came from Ireland, Germany, and other parts of Europe. Economic hardship, political unrest, and limited opportunity abroad encouraged migration. The United States offered land, employment, and the promise of social mobility. Most immigrants entered through port cities. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore served as primary points of arrival. From there, some remained in cities, while others moved inland along established transportation routes. Arrival was rarely easy. The journey across the Atlantic could take weeks. Conditions aboard ships were crowded. Illness spread easily. Food supplies were limited. Uponeribal newcomers often possessed little more than what they could carry. Yet ports provided opportunity. Dock work, construction, domestic service, and factory labor offered immediate employment. Immigrants filled positions that required endurance and long hours. Wages were modest, but regular income offered stability unavailable in their places of origin. Urban neighborhoods changed accordingly. Languages mixed in streets and marketplaces. Signs appeared in multiple languages. Churches served specific ethnic communities. Social networks formed around shared origins. Cultural differences required adjustment. Customs regarding work, religion, and family life varied. Integration occurred unevenly. Some communities blended gradually into broader society. Others remained distinct for generations. Tensions. Emerging native-born citizens sometimes viewed immigrants with suspicion. Competition for jobs increased. Religious differences, particularly between Protestant majorities and Catholic newcomers, generated distrust in certain regions. Political leaders debated immigration's impact. Some welcomed population growth as a source of labor and national strength. Others feared cultural fragmentation. Despite disagreement, immigration continued. The expanding economy required workers. Factories, canals, railroads, and farms depended on labor supply. Immigrants met that demand. In rural areas, immigrant farmers purchased land and established new communities. German-speaking settlements developed in Pennsylvania and the Midwest. Agricultural practices adapted to local conditions while retaining familiar traditions. Urban environments required different adjustments. Housing was often crowded. Tenement buildings emerged to accommodate growing populations. Sanitation challenges increased. Municipal governments struggled to keep pace with population growth. Yet cities also offered access to institutions. Public schools expanded gradually. Mutual aid societies formed to support members during illness or unemployment. Newspapers printed in immigrant languages circulated news and guidance. Immigrant labor contributed directly to infrastructure development. Canal digging, road construction, and later railroad building relied heavily on foreign-born workers. These projects connected regions and supported national growth. The presence of diverse populations influenced culture. Music, food, and traditions blended. Markets offered unfamiliar goods. Public celebrations reflected multiple heritages. Language adaptation occurred gradually. While many immigrants initially retained native languages, English became increasingly necessary for commerce and political participation. Bilingual households were common. Children often adapted more quickly than adults. Attendance at local schools accelerated linguistic and cultural integration. Over time, second-generation immigrants navigated both inherited traditions and American norms. Immigration also influenced politics. New citizens gained voting rights in many states. After meeting residency requirements, political parties courted immigrant communities. Urban political organizations emerged, offering assistance in exchange for loyalty. This participation expanded democratic engagement, but also raised concerns about corruption and influence. Meanwhile, internal migration continued. Americans born in eastern states moved westward seeking land and opportunity. These movements interacted with immigration patterns, creating diverse frontier settlements. The population of the nation increased steadily. With growth came complexity. The idea of a single, uniform American identity became less precise. Regional, ethnic, and cultural distinctions coexisted within national boundaries. Yet shared experiences developed. Participation in local economies, engagement with institutions, and adaptation to laws created common reference points. Over time, civic participation provided cohesion. The presence of new voices did not erase existing social divisions. Enslavement continued in southern states. Indigenous populations faced displacement. Inequality remained embedded in economic structures. But immigration added layers to the national story. The United States was no longer defined solely by those who had fought the Revolution or descended from colonial settlers. It became a country shaped by arrival as well as inheritance. This demographic change did not produce immediate unity. It produced negotiation. Communities adjusted practices. Institutions adapted slowly. Laws evolved. The process was ongoing. The nation absorbed newcomers unevenly but persistently. As population increased and diversity expanded, the United States grew more complex. New faces altered neighborhoods. New voices entered public debate, and the meaning of belonging continued to develop alongside the country itself. After the American Revolution, the United States wasn't content to just hug the Atlantic coast. Imagine a vast, seemingly endless expanse of land to the west. It was fertile, promising, but it wasn't empty. And so, the great push westward began almost as soon as the ink on the peace treaty was dry. Settlers, filled with hope and grit, started pouring over the Appalachian Mountains. This was the frontier, a place of both incredible opportunity and immense hardship. To bring some order to this chaos, the government passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This was a blueprint, a set of rules for how new territories could be carved out and eventually become states, equal to the original 13. On paper, it all looked neat and tidy, but on the ground, life was anything but. Picture this. Entire families packed into creaky wagons, carrying everything they owned. Tools, seeds for a future farm, pots and pans, a few cherished heirlooms. Their journey wasn't a quick road trip. It took weeks, sometimes months. The roads were little more than rough dirt tracks. They had to ration food and water carefully, always aware that a broken axle, a sudden illness, or a serious injury could spell disaster miles from any help. And even when they finally arrived at their destination, the real work had just begun. The land wasn't a ready-made farm. It was often covered in dense forest that had to be cleared by hand, tree by painstaking tree. They had to learn about new soils, unpredictable weather patterns, and how to survive in near-total isolation. Communication was slow. A letter to family back east could take months to arrive. Markets for their crops were far away, making trade difficult. In this lonely world, your nearest neighbor, who might be miles away, became your lifeline. But what drove them on? The powerful lure of land. In Europe, owning land was a dream reserved for the wealthy elite. Here, it was within reach. The government surveyed the vast territories, dividing them into neat plots that ordinary people could buy. These land sales weren't just about encouraging settlement. They also filled the young nation's treasury, funding its growth. Of course, there's a crucial part of this story we can't ignore. These lands were not unoccupied. For countless generations, indigenous nations had lived there, with their own governments, cultures, and deep connections to the land. Westward expansion wasn't a peaceful filling of empty space. It was an intrusion, and it inevitably led to conflict. The young United States inherited a complicated legacy of treaties and disputes from the British. At first, there were attempts at negotiation, but the power dynamic was completely skewed. The relentless pressure from settlers wanting more and more land was unstoppable. As claims overlapped, violence erupted across the frontier. Federal policy toward Native Americans became a confusing and often brutal mix of diplomacy and military force. Treaties were signed, celebrated, and then, as settlers advanced, they were revised or flat-out broken. The recurring pattern was one of removal, displacement, and desperate resistance. For the settlers building new lives, survival was a daily struggle that required constant vigilance. They built their first homes quickly, often simple log cabins made from trees they felled themselves. The first priority was a roof over their heads, protection from harsh weather and wild animals. Communities grew slowly, forming around shared needs for defense, help with harvests, and companionship. It was only after a settlement felt a bit more stable that you'd start to see the first churches and schools pop up. In the early days, every ounce of energy was focused on just making it through to the next season. Life on the frontier demanded that you be a jack of all. Men and women both had to take on multiple roles. Farming was the main gig, but you also had to be a hunter to supplement your food supply, a carpenter to build and repair your home, and a blacksmith to fix your tools because you couldn't just pop down to the store for a new one. Every resource was precious and had to be carefully conserved. Getting goods to market was a huge challenge until transportation improved. If you were lucky enough to live near a river, you might build a flatboat to float your produce downstream. But for many, markets were just too far away. As the population grew, however, These isolated pockets of settlement slowly began to connect, forming new trade networks. As territories grew and their populations hit a certain number, they could apply for statehood. This was a key principle of the expansion. New states weren't colonies. They joined the Union as equals. This process reinforced the idea of a growing, dynamic republic. Then, in 1803, something happened that changed the map forever. The Louisiana Purchase. With a single transaction, President Jefferson bought a massive territory from France, effectively doubling the size of the United States overnight. This incredible acquisition sparked a new wave of exploration. The most famous expedition, of course, was led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They were sent to map this new territory, find a water route to the Pacific, and document the plants, animals, and people they encountered. Their journey was an epic adventure that captured the nation's imagination. Now, just because the U.S. owned this land didn't mean it was settled right away. For decades, vast portions of the Louisiana Territory remained the domain of native tribes and fur trappers, but the direction of the country's momentum was unmistakable. West. Throughout the early 19th century, the tide of westward expansion kept rolling, fueled by a growing population, economic ambition, and the powerful idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was destined to stretch from coast to coast. But this expansion also had a dark side. It deepened the already dangerous divisions within the country, particularly over the issue of slavery. Every time a new territory was ready to become a state, a fierce debate erupted. Would it be a free state or a slave state? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a desperate attempt to keep the peace by maintaining a balance of power, but it was really just a temporary patch on a wound that was growing deeper. Back on the frontier, however, these big political debates often seemed distant. People were consumed by more immediate concerns. Clearing another field, building a stronger shelter, and figuring out how to get supplies. For a long time, these settlements were far from any established government. Law and order were often informal. Local sheriffs and judges only appeared once a community was large enough to support them. Until then, order was maintained by community standards and, sometimes, by vigilante justice. The experience of the frontier wasn't the same for everyone. Some regions, blessed with fertile soil and river access, prospered relatively quickly. Others struggled for years with bad harvests, difficult terrain, and isolation from trade routes. The process of expansion was messy, uneven, and filled with contradictions. For indigenous communities, the consequences were nothing short of catastrophic. Land was taken through treaties that were often signed under duress. Military campaigns were waged against those who resisted. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the forced relocation of thousands of people, most famously the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, from their ancestral homelands in the southeast to territory west of the Mississippi River. These forced marches resulted in immense suffering and loss of life. For the settlers, expansion offered the promise of a better life, but it demanded incredible resilience and endurance. The government tried to manage this explosive growth with laws, land surveys, and treaties, but often events on the ground moved far faster than the politicians in Washington. The frontier remained a place of profound uncertainty. Yet, it was also the place where a new American identity was being forged. As new states joined the Union, the country's political center of gravity began to shift westward. Economic networks stretched further and further inland. The physical boundaries of the nation were constantly expanding. This growth brought incredible new resources and agricultural wealth, strengthening the United States on the world stage. But this growth came at a tremendous cost. It intensified the internal conflicts that would eventually lead to the Civil War, and it was built on the displacement and suffering of native peoples. The United States grew larger, but it also became more complex, more divided, and more difficult to hold together. The uneasy frontier was both an engine of opportunity and a source of deep, lasting conflict. And as this great migration continued, it shaped the nation into what it is today, with all of its strengths, its contradictions, and its unresolved history. In the early years of the Republic, news traveled at the speed of a horse. A letter written in Philadelphia might take days to reach Boston. Information from the frontier could require weeks to arrive in eastern cities. Political decisions, trade updates, and personal correspondence moved slowly across uneven roads. Over time, that pace began to change. The expansion of the postal system played a central role. After the Post Office Act of 1792, postal routes multiplied. Mail delivery became more regular. Postriders followed established paths between towns, carrying bundles of letters and newspapers. The number of post offices increased steadily. By the early 19th century, even smaller communities had access to postal services. The federal government viewed the postal network as essential for maintaining national cohesion. Newspapers benefited from these developments. In the late 18th century, newspapers were already common in major cities. As printing costs declined and literacy improved, circulation expanded. Weekly publications appeared in smaller towns. Political essays, advertisements, shipping reports, and local notices filled their pages. Editors often aligned with political parties. Newspapers became instruments of debate as well as information. Federalists and Democratic Republicans used print to argue policy positions and criticize opponents. Despite partisanship, the growth of newspapers created shared awareness. Citizens in different states read about the same congressional decisions. They followed elections beyond their local districts. They learned of international developments that might affect trade or diplomacy. Printing technology advanced gradually. Improved presses increased speed and output. Paper production expanded. Distribution networks strengthened through stagecoach lines and river transport. Information still required physical movement, but that movement became more efficient. In 1844, a more dramatic shift occurred. Samuel Morse successfully demonstrated the electric telegraph between Washington and Baltimore. The message sent, "What hath God wrought?" marked the beginning of rapid electronic communication. Telegraph lines spread along railroad routes. Messages that once required days could now be transmitted in minutes. News organizations adopted telegraph technology quickly. Financial markets responded to real-time information. The effect on national awareness was significant. Elections could be reported quickly. Legislative decisions circulated widely within hours. Newspapers coordinated reporting across states. The telegraph did not eliminate print media. Instead, it accelerated the flow of content into newspapers. Information began to synchronize. Events in one region influenced responses. In another, more rapidly. Economic activity adjusted accordingly. Commodity prices responded to distant market conditions. Merchants made decisions based on timely updates. Political movements gained momentum more quickly. Speeches delivered in one city could be summarized and printed nationwide within days. Reform campaigns, religious revivals, and public controversies spread beyond local boundaries. The expansion of literacy supported this information growth. Public schooling developed gradually in northern states. Printed material became more accessible. Pamphlets and books circulated more widely. Information networks also extended into rural areas. Farmers subscribed to newspapers. Traveling lecturers brought news and ideas to smaller communities. Printed almanacs provided calendars, weather forecasts, and general knowledge. The nation began to think together more frequently. Shared information fostered shared conversation. However, faster communication did not eliminate disagreement. In some cases, it intensified division. Political arguments circulated more widely. Controversial issues reached broader audiences. Public opinion polarized around certain debates, yet the overall effects strengthened national awareness. Citizens became more conscious of belonging to a larger system. Developments in Washington mattered in frontier towns. Economic shifts in New York affected merchants in distant regions. Information reduced isolation. Distance remained physical, but awareness bridged space. Newspapers also reflected social change. Immigrant communities published papers in their native languages. Religious groups circulated newsletters. Abolitionists' presses advocated for the end of slavery. Reformers used print to promote temperance, education, and women's rights. These movements gained traction because communication networks supported them. Railroads further accelerated distribution. As track mileage expanded in the mid-19th century, newspapers and mail traveled faster. Urban printing presses produced daily editions with increasing circulation. The combination of postal service, print media, telegraph lines, and railroads transformed the rhythm of national life. Information no longer lagged far behind events. Markets adjusted quickly. Political campaigns organized more efficiently. Public reaction became more immediate. This transformation strengthened federal authority indirectly. National institutions operated in an environment where communication allowed coordination. At the same time, citizens gained greater access to knowledge about government actions. Information became both tool and accountability measure. The United States, once loosely connected by fragile roads, developed networks of awareness. People still lived in varied regions with distinct local concerns, but they read similar headlines. They followed common debates. They responded to shared events. The nation began not only to expand physically and economically, but to align intellectually. Ideas traveled faster, opinions formed more rapidly, and the sense of belonging to a single country grew stronger with each printed page and transmitted message. In its earliest years, the United States focused primarily on survival and internal organization. Over time, that focus widened. Trade was the first bridge outward. Even before independence, colonial economies had depended on international exchange. After the Revolution, American merchants sought new markets and renewed access to old ones. Ships left eastern ports carrying agricultural products, timber, and raw materials. They returned with manufactured goods, tea, sugar, and tools. Commerce connected the young nation to Europe, the Caribbean, and beyond. Foreign governments observed cautiously. The United States had emerged from war as a sovereign state, but its long-term stability remained uncertain. European powers evaluated its creditworthiness and political durability. Diplomatic relations developed gradually. Treaties were negotiated with Britain, France, Spain, and other nations. Agreements addressed trade rights, navigation, access, and boundary disputes. One early challenge involved British forts that remained in Western territories after the Revolutionary War. Negotiation and diplomacy were required to resolve these issues peacefully. The Jay Treaty of 1794 attempted to stabilize relations with Britain and encourage trade. It generated domestic controversy but prevented renewed conflict. Trade expansion brought both opportunity and risk. American ships faced dangers from piracy and from interference by European powers during periods of war. The young nation lacked a large navy at first. Merchant vessels were vulnerable. In response, Congress authorized the construction of naval ships to protect commerce. The United States Navy was formally established in the 1790s. Early actions focused on safeguarding trade routes, including engagements with privateers in the Mediterranean. These measures signaled that the country intended to defend its economic interests. The War of 1812 further clarified America's position in the international system. Though the conflict centered on maritime rights and British interference, its outcome reinforced sovereignty. After the war, trade resumed with renewed confidence. American merchants expanded their reach. Whaling ships traveled to distant oceans. Traders engaged with markets in Asia and South America. Commercial networks broadened. The Monroe Doctrine, articulated in 1823, reflected a shift in diplomatic posture. It declared opposition to further European colonization in the Americas, while the United States lacked immediate capacity to enforce this doctrine fully. The statement indicated growing industrial growth strengthened economic influence. As manufacturing increased, exports diversified. Cotton became a dominant export in the 19th century, linking American plantations to textile mills in Britain and elsewhere. This economic integration positioned the United States as a significant participant in global markets. Immigration further connected the country to international developments. Political upheaval in Europe influenced migration patterns. Economic downturns abroad affected American trade. The nation could no longer operate in isolation. Foreign policy remained cautious overall. Leaders often preferred neutrality, avoiding entanglement in European conflicts when possible. George Washington's early warnings about foreign alliances shaped policy for decades. However, neutrality did not mean disengagement. Diplomats negotiated boundaries, secured trade agreements, and managed disputes. The Louisiana Purchase itself reflected international negotiation, reshaping the nation's geographic and strategic position. As the 19th century progressed, the United States expanded its territorial reach beyond continental boundaries. The annexation of Texas, acquisition of California and the Southwest after the Mexican-American War, and later purchases such as Alaska extended national presence. These actions influenced foreign perceptions. Other nations recognized that the United States possessed both ambition and capacity for expansion. Economic power grew alongside territorial growth. Railroads linked interior regions to coastal ports, facilitating export. Industrial production increased national wealth. By the late 19th century, American goods competed more directly in international markets. Naval modernization followed. New steel ships replaced older wooden vessels. Naval strategy shifted toward protecting trade and projecting influence abroad. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked another transition. Victory expanded American influence into the Caribbean and Pacific. The acquisition of territories such as Puerto Rico and the Philippines signaled a broader global presence. Public debate accompanied these developments. Some supported expansion as evidence of national strength. Others warned against imperial entanglement. Regardless of opinion, the nation's position had changed. The United States was no longer a fragile experiment focused solely on internal stability. It had become a participant in global affairs. Economic ties, diplomatic agreements, and military capacity linked it to events far beyond its borders. International awareness became part of domestic life. Newspapers reported foreign conflicts alongside local news. Trade fluctuations abroad affected prices at home. Immigration connected families across oceans. The country that once struggled to connect its own states now maintained communication and commerce across continents. This expansion outward did not replace internal development. It added another layer. The United States began to see itself not only as a collection of states building unity, but as a nation operating within a wider world. And with that recognition came new responsibilities, new debates, and new challenges. The country had noticed the world, and the world had noticed the country. When we think about the American Civil War, our minds usually jump to epic battles like Gettysburg or Antietam, to generals like Grant and Lee, or to the abolition of slavery. And while those are all crucial parts of the story, there's another massive piece of the puzzle that often gets overlooked. The home front. What was life actually like for the millions of people who weren't on the battlefield? How did this brutal conflict reshape American society from the inside out? Today, we were going to dive deep into the profound and often heartbreaking impact the Civil War had on the families, economies, and communities left behind. This isn't just a story of soldiers. It's the story of a nation in turmoil. Let us start with the most immediate impact. The sheer human cost felt in every town and city. With over 3 million men serving in the Union and Confederate armies, nearly every family had a direct connection to the war. Imagine opening the newspaper each day, your heart pounding as you scan the casualty lists, praying not to see a familiar name. Letters from the front were lifelines, but they were often delayed, censored, or worse, never arrived. The constant uncertainty and anxiety were a heavy burden that people carried for 4 long years. Women, in particular, found their lives completely upended. They weren't just waiting anxiously. They were thrust into new roles, managing farms, businesses, and households entirely on their own. Often for the first time, they became the sole providers and protectors of their families, all while dealing with the emotional strain of having their husbands, sons, and brothers in constant danger. This brings us to the immense economic shifts that occurred, which played out very differently in the North and the South. In the Union, the war actually spurred an industrial boom. Factories churned out weapons, uniforms, and supplies at an unprecedented rate. This created jobs and led to the rise of new industries. However, it wasn't all positive. This rapid industrialization also led to inflation. Prices for everyday goods like flour, coffee, and coal skyrocketed, making it difficult for working-class families to make ends meet, even with the new job opportunities. Profiteering was rampant, with some manufacturers cutting corners and selling shoddy goods to the government at inflated prices. So, while the northern economy as a whole grew stronger, it came with significant social friction and hardship for many ordinary citizens. Now, let's turn our attention to the Confederacy, where the economic story was one of near-total collapse. The Union's naval blockade, known as the Anaconda Plan, was devastatingly effective. It choked off the South's ability to export its main cash crop, cotton, and import necessary supplies. As the war dragged on, shortages became the norm. Everyday items we take for granted became unobtainable luxuries. People resorted to making coffee from roasted acorns, and salt was so scarce it had to be painstakingly extracted from the dirt floors of smokehouses. Inflation in the South was hyperinflation. A pair of shoes could cost hundreds of Confederate dollars, and the currency became almost worthless. This widespread desperation led to social unrest. In cities like Richmond, Virginia, women who couldn't feed their children organized bread riots, breaking into shops to take the food they so desperately needed. The Southern home front wasn't just anxious, it was starving. Beyond the economic turmoil, the war fundamentally challenged and changed social structures. For women, both North and South, the war was a catalyst for entering public life in new ways. Thousands served as nurses, transforming a previously male-dominated field. Women like Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, braved horrific conditions on the front lines to care for the wounded. They organized aid societies, raised funds, and packed supplies. This newfound responsibility and visibility planted the seeds for the women's suffrage movement that would gain momentum in the decades following the war. Women proved they were more than capable of handling responsibilities outside the domestic sphere, and they wouldn't easily go back to the way things were. For African Americans, the war was, of course, a fight for freedom. On the home front in the South, enslaved people faced a complex and dangerous reality. Many seized the opportunity presented by the chaos of war to escape to Union lines, a courageous act of self. Those who remained on plantations often engaged in acts of resistance, slowing down work or providing intelligence to Union troops. In the North, free black communities were instrumental in the war effort. They actively recruited for the newly formed United States colored troops and organized aid for formerly enslaved people. However, they also faced significant racism and discrimination. The New York City draft riots of 1863 were a horrific example, where white working-class mobs, angry about the draft, targeted black residents in a wave of brutal violence. It was a stark reminder that the fight for freedom and equality was far from over. The war also left deep psychological scars on the home front. The concept of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't understood, but the effects were real. Soldiers returned home physically and mentally broken, and their families had to learn how to care for them. The grief was immense and nationwide. Nearly every family lost someone, creating a collective trauma that would linger for generations. Photography played a new and powerful role in bringing the horror of the war home. For the first time, people could see graphic images of the battlefield, making the distant conflict feel terrifyingly real. This visual evidence of the war's brutality shaped public opinion and contributed to the widespread sense of mourning that blanketed the nation. Finally, the Civil War forced a massive expansion of government power into the everyday lives of its citizens. Both the Union and Confederate governments instituted conscription, or a military draft, for the first time in American history. This was deeply controversial and seen by many as an infringement on personal liberty. Governments also levied new taxes, including the first income tax in U.S. history, to finance the astronomical costs of the war. They suspended habeas corpus, allowing for the arrest and detention of citizens without trial. These actions set a precedent for a more powerful and centralized federal government, a shift that continues to shape American politics to this day. The war proved that in times of national crises, the government would take unprecedented steps that directly impacted the lives and liberties of people on the home front. So, when we look back at the Civil War, it's essential to see the complete picture. The story isn't just on the battlefields. It's in the homes, farms, and factories across the nation. It's in the resilience of women stepping into new roles, the courage of African Americans fighting for their own liberation, the economic desperation that led to riots, and the collective grief of a nation at war with itself. The home front was its own kind of battlefield, where the struggles were different but no less significant. It was here that the social, economic, and political foundations of modern America were forged in the crucible of conflict. Understanding this side of the war gives us a much richer, more human perspective on this defining chapter in American history. The American Civil War. A conflict that tore a nation apart, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. But from the ashes of this brutal struggle, something new and powerful was forged. This wasn't just a story of political freedom. It was the story of an unprecedented explosion of industry, innovation, an ambition that would reshape the United States and, ultimately, the world. In the decades following the war, America transformed from a largely agrarian society into an industrial behemoth. This is the story of how that happened. This is the Gilded Age. Before the war, America's economy was sharply divided. The North was industrializing, with factories, textiles, and a growing network of railways. The South, on the other hand, was built on an agricultural economy, one brutally dependent on the institution of slavery. The war shattered that system and, in doing so, cleared the path for a single, unified, industrial economic model to dominate the entire continent. The federal government, emboldened by its victory, began to actively promote industrial and westward expansion. Policies like the Homestead Act encouraged settlement of the West, while massive land grants and subsidies were handed to railroad companies. And the railroads, they were the iron arteries of this new nation. Before the war, rail lines were fragmented, but now, the race was on to connect east and west. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah, was more than just a feat of engineering. It was a symbol of national unity and manifest destiny. Suddenly, raw materials from the resource-rich West timber, and cattle could be transported to the manufacturing centers of the East with incredible speed. And in turn, finished goods could be shipped back to the new markets opening up across the country. This interconnectedness fueled a cycle of growth that was simply staggering. With the resources flowing, new industries boomed. Steel was at the heart of it all. Before the 1850s, steel was expensive and difficult to produce, but the invention of the Bessemer process changed everything. This new technique made it possible to mass-produce strong, cheap steel. And who was there to capitalize on it? A Scottish immigrant named Andrew Carnegie. He built a steel empire in Pittsburgh, creating the backbone for everything from skyscrapers and bridges to the very rails the trains ran on. Carnegie's vertical integration controlling every step of the production process. From the iron ore mines to the finished steel beams was a revolutionary business model that others would quickly copy. Another resource was about to change the world. Oil, or as it was first called, rock oil. Initially seen as a nuisance, it was soon discovered that it could be refined into kerosene, a cheap and efficient source of light that replaced whale oil lamps in homes across America. John D. Rockefeller saw the potential not in drilling for oil, but in refining and controlling its distribution. Through his company, Standard Oil, he used ruthless tactics driving competitors out of business. Securing secret deals with railroads to create a near-total monopoly. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of the oil refining in the United States. He brought order and efficiency to a chaotic industry, but also set a controversial precedent for corporate power. This era was also a golden age of invention. Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, established the world's first industrial research lab. Here, he and his team churned out invention after invention, including the phonograph and, most famously, a commercially viable incandescent light bulb. In 1882, he switched on the first central power station in New York City, illuminating a small section of Manhattan and heralding the dawn of the electrical age. Electricity would not only light up the night, but also power the factories of the Second Industrial Revolution, allowing them to run 24 hours a day. All this growth demanded a massive workforce, and it came in waves. Millions of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, Jews, and Slavs poured into the country, seeking a better life. They were joined by displaced farmers from rural America, all flocking to the rapidly expanding cities. These new urban centers, New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, became melting pots of culture and labor. But life for these workers was often grim. They lived in crowded, unsanitary tenements and toiled for long hours in dangerous factories for meager wages. The immense fortunes amassed by men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan, the powerful financier, led author Mark Twain to dub this period the Gilded Age. On the surface, it was an age of glittering wealth, technological marvels, and progress. But beneath that thin layer of gold lay widespread poverty, corruption, and social unrest. Workers began to organize into labor unions to fight for better conditions, leading to violent clashes like the Haymarket Affair and the Pullman Strike. Populist movements rose in the West and South, as farmers felt squeezed by railroad monopolies and unfair banking practices. These conflicts exposed deep inequalities at the heart of America's new industrial society. Yet, despite the turmoil, the foundation for modern America was laid during these few short decades. The period after the Civil War was a crucible time of intense pressure and transformation. It created legendary titans of industry and gave birth to technologies that still shape our lives today. From the steel in our buildings to the electricity in our walls, it also raised fundamental questions about the role of government, the power of corporations, and the rights of workers. Debates that continue to this very day. The Gilded Age proved that rebuilding a nation is about more than just politics. It's about harnessing the relentless, often messy, but undeniably powerful forces of human innovation and industry. This rapid, dramatic transformation set the stage for America to emerge as a global superpower in the 20th century. The factories, the networks, and the wealth built during this era would provide the might to navigate to world wars and beyond. It's a complex legacy of incredible progress and profound social struggle. A story of a nation reforging itself in the fires of industry. By the middle of the 20th century, the position of the United States had changed in ways that earlier generations could not have anticipated. 2 world wars had altered global power structures. European economies were weakened. Infrastructure across large parts of the world had been damaged. In contrast, the continental United States had avoided large-scale destruction on its own soil. Its industrial capacity remained intact. Its military forces had expanded and modernized. Its financial systems had strengthened through wartime production and international lending. After World War II, the United States participated in rebuilding efforts abroad. Economic programs supported recovery in Europe and Asia. International institutions were established with American involvement, including the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. The country's influence extended beyond trade. Military alliances formed. Overseas bases were established. Diplomatic commitments expanded. The Cold War introduced a prolonged period of strategic competition, particularly with the Soviet Union. Technological development accelerated under these conditions. Research in aviation, nuclear energy, and space exploration received substantial investment. The launch of satellites and the eventual landing on the moon reflected both scientific advancement and geopolitical competition. At home, prosperity increased during the post-war decades. Manufacturing output remained strong. Consumer goods were widely available. Suburban development expanded. Higher education enrollment rose, supported by federal programs. Television and radio connected households to national and international events. Information flowed continuously. Global developments became part of daily awareness. The country's economic scale placed it at the center of global markets. The US dollar became a widely used reserve currency. Financial institutions influenced international trade and development. This role did not emerge from a single declaration. There was no formal announcement of superpower status. Instead, influence accumulated. Military presence abroad became routine. Economic policy shaped global outcomes. Cultural exports, films, music, technology circulated internationally. The nation that once struggled to coordinate among its own states now participated in decisions affecting multiple continents. Other countries observed its actions closely. Allies relied on its commitments. Rivals measured its capabilities. The United States did not stop facing internal challenges. Civil rights movements, economic shifts, and political disagreements continued. Yet internationally, its position carried weight. Leadership brought responsibility. Diplomatic decisions had global consequences. Economic policies affected international stability. The country had become not only a participant in the world, but a central actor. And that transformation occurred gradually, through accumulated capacity rather than sudden proclamation. Imagine stepping back in time to 1783. The United States is a fledgling republic, a scattered collection of states, its future of anything but certain. Now, fast forward to the late 20th century. What do you see? A nation transformed. Its borders are firmly drawn. Its government is a permanent fixture, and its economy is a giant on the world stage. Its military influence stretches far beyond its own coastlines. This wasn't the uncertain experiment of the late 1700s. This was a global superpower. Yet, despite this monumental shift, if you looked closely at the rhythm of daily life, you'd find something familiar, something constant. People still woke up in the morning, got ready for work, and sent their children off to school. Shops opened their doors, and millions of people commuted to offices, factories, and stores. Even in this age of advanced technology, the day was shaped by routine, a steady pulse that beat beneath the surface of grand historical changes. This simple, everyday rhythm was, and still is, the engine of the nation. Of course, the nature of that daily work had evolved dramatically. The America of the late 20th century was no longer a primarily agricultural society. Fewer and fewer people tilled the soil. Manufacturing, once the backbone of the economy, was becoming increasingly automated, with machines taking over tasks once done by human hands. In their place, service industries boomed, and a new giant emerged: information technology. This digital revolution created entirely new kinds of jobs, careers that demanded education and intellectual skill rather than physical strength. The way Americans earned a living was fundamentally different, reflecting a nation that had moved from fields to factories, and now to computer screens. And with this new technology came a staggering acceleration in communication. Think about it. Television, which once seemed like a miracle, was quickly being supplemented by personal computers and the vast, interconnected web of digital networks. News didn't just travel fast, it traveled instantly. An event happening on the other side of the planet could be seen and heard in homes across America in real time. Global markets reacted not in days or hours, but in mere seconds. And on a personal level, people could maintain close contact with friends and family across vast distances without any delay. The world had shrunk, and the pace of life had quickened in ways previous generations could never have imagined. But here's the fascinating part. Amidst all this whirlwind of change, the fundamental structures of the nation remained remarkably recognizable. The Constitution, written over 2 centuries earlier, still served as the ultimate guide for governance. Elections, the lifeblood of the republic, continued to be held at regular, predictable intervals. The courts went about their work, interpreting the law as they always had. The delicate dance between state authority and federal power continued, a dynamic tension built into the country's very design. And that core debate, the one that has been present since the very beginning, the balance between individual liberty and collective security, was still as relevant and as fiercely contested as ever. The framework held strong, even as everything around it was being Another constant thread woven through the nation's history is immigration. This has always been a defining feature of the American experience, and the late 20th century was no different. New communities, with their own unique flavors and traditions, sprang up in bustling cities and sprawling suburbs. This constant influx of people from all over the world meant that American culture was never static. It was always evolving, blending, and creating something new. These demographic shifts continually remade the face of the nation, ensuring it was always a work in progress. The economy, too, followed a familiar, if sometimes bumpy, pattern. The cycles of boom and bust persisted. Periods of exciting expansion and prosperity would inevitably be followed by the belt-tightening of a recession. In response, policymakers would adjust interest rates, spending, and regulations, trying to steer the massive economic ship through choppy waters. This cycle of growth, contraction, and correction was a built-in feature of the system. And on the global stage, America's responsibilities endured. The military alliances forged in the crucible of past conflicts remained active. Complex trade agreements continued to shape international markets, linking America's economy inextricably with the rest of the world. And as new global challenges emerged, from environmental concerns to regional conflicts, American diplomats were at the negotiating table, trying to find solutions. The nation couldn't retreat from the world. It was too deeply embedded within it. So, by this point, the country was clearly no longer new. It had shed its youthful uncertainty. But here's the most important takeaway. It wasn't finished either. The project of nation building was an one-time event that was completed and signed off on in the 18th century. It has always been a continuous, ongoing process. A process shaped by the laying of railroad tracks and fiber optic cables, by the hum of industry, by the waves of migration, by the struggles of conflict, and by the constant need to adapt to new realities. Think about how that transformation happened. The United States grew from a loose, fragile confederation of states into a complex and influential global power. But this didn't happen because of a single battle, a single invention, or a single leader. It was the result of a steady, patient accumulation. It was built through laws that were written, debated, and refined over time. It was built through institutions that were strengthened by repetition and trust, day after day, year after year, and most of all, it was built by the labor performed daily, across generations, by millions of ordinary people. This grand transformation from a fragile republic to a global power didn't happen in spite of ordinary life. It rested directly upon it. The entire massive structure was supported by the foundation of routine, in the quiet rhythm of work schedules and school calendars, in the simple act of voting, and in the unseen activities within every household. The long, slow process of nation-building continued, day by day. The country that once struggled just to define itself now operated within powerful, established systems. Yet, even within those systems, change remained the only true constant. The nation was no longer new. It had history. It had weight. It had permanence. But it was still, and will always be, becoming. The story wasn't over. It was just entering its next chapter. When the United States first stood independent, it stood without certainty. There was no assurance that 13 separate states could function as one country. No guarantee that a written constitution would endure. No proof that economic instability could be resolved without collapse. And yet, through steady adjustment, the nation continued. It built systems. It repaired weaknesses. It expanded, sometimes carefully, sometimes forcefully. It industrialized. It communicated more quickly. It engaged with the wider world, and over generations, it accumulated strength. There was no single turning point when the country stopped being new. There was only continuity. Each generation inherited structures built by the previous one and altered them. The early republic worried about debt and disunity. Later generations managed industry and global influence. The form changed. The routine continued. Nation building was not confined to the 18th century. It remains ongoing. The country that once struggled to define itself now operates within long-established systems. But the work of balancing power, liberty, growth, and responsibility has never ended. When America was new, it faced uncertainty. When it became established, it faced responsibility. And through it all, daily life continued, measured in workdays, elections, conversations, and quiet adjustments. The nation was never completed. It was constructed gradually, and it continues to evolve. If this journey through the early decades of American nation-building has offered perspective or reflection, you are always welcome to return. History does not move only in moments of noise. It often moves in steady, ordinary progression. And sometimes, that quiet progression shapes the world more than any single event.